The Egyptian Empire. An empire that was among the first and longest ruling civilisations in human history and lasted nearly 3,000 years. Over the years, the empire flourished and eventually crumbled as power moved from dynasty to dynasty, while neighbouring powers periodically invaded. History demonstrates that even the most powerful civilisations may collapse, and about 1100 BC, Egypt showed this to be true. To know the exact reason how such a great empire could fall so quickly, we have to go back in time. Ancient Egypt has a rich and great history with remarkable engineering work, captivating works of art, advances in writing, and wars for power. The major source of information regarding ancient Egypt is the many objects, monuments, and artifacts found at excavation sites in recently interpreted graffiti and carvings. The image that emerges is a culture that only a few can match in artistic beauty, architectural perfection, or the bounty of religious traditions. At that time, Egypt was a distinguished citizen of the Mediterranean world from its consolidation around 3100 BC until its invasion by Alexander the Great in 332 BC for nearly 30 centuries. Egypt's grandeur has long fascinated historians and archaeologists, from the Old Kingdom's massive pyramids to the New Kingdom's military conquests, giving rise to Egyptology's vibrant and unique field. This all started with the predynastic period. Archaeologists have found a few artifacts or written records from the predynastic period that incorporated almost 2,000 years of successive progress in the culture of Egypt. Most of the population of predynastic Egypt was combined with the successors of Paleolithic residents of Northeast Africa who gradually migrated from the unfavorable Grand Sand Sea. Thousands of people migrated from the Sahara Desert in the 3rd millennium BC. It was not easy to change the lifestyle and occupations of people from nomadic hunters to agriculturalists. Around 3400 BC, 2 independent kingdoms were built close to Fertile Crescent. This region is home to several of the oldest civilizations in the world. The Northern Red Land, located in the Nile Delta and alongside the Nile River, probably extends to Atfi. The White Lands extend south from Atfi to Gebel es Silsila. The king of the south, Scorpion, made his first attempt to invade the northern kingdom in around 3200 BC. After a century, King Menes conquered the Northern Empire and unified the country. He became the earliest king of the introductory dynasty. The Early Dynastic Period. The Early Dynastic Period came after the Predynastic Period, and it was followed by the era called the Old Kingdom. King Menes was the first king of the first dynasty. The king married a princess from Nakada to strengthen the ties between the two cities. Some historians believe that the king's wife, Neithotep, became a ruler after the death of her husband. Her tomb was discovered, and it was the tomb of an emperor. Her name was inscribed on her tomb, and in ancient Egypt, this practice was for emperors only. All of this suggests her status is more than just a wife. However, these suggestions are not universally accepted yet. King Menes built the ancient Egyptian capital at the White Walls, which was later recognized as Memphis, near the top of the northern Nile Delta. Capital became a metropolis that controlled Egyptian civilization throughout the Old Kingdom. The early dynastic period witnessed the growth of the grounds of Egypt, including the vital ideology of royal power. Ancient Egyptians saw kings as godlike beings and closely identified them with the mighty god Horus. History's oldest known hieroglyphs also belong to this early dynastic period. Like other periods in Egyptian history, most of the ancient Egyptians in the Archaic period were farmers. They lived in humble villages, and the Egyptian kingdom's economy was based on agriculture. The annual floods of the River Nile provided essential fertilization and irrigation every year. Farmers planted wheat following the receding of floods and harvested before the return of heat and drought. This period was a historical era in the history of Egypt, as the Upper and Lower Egypt combined its regions under one governing system. During this time, the title of pharaoh was not used. Rather, the rulers were addressed as Your Majesty or kings. The Old Kingdom Age. The Old Kingdom, or the Age of Pyramid Builders, starts from 2686 BC. This era is primarily known for the construction of the Great Pyramid. The third dynasty of the pharaohs was the beginning of the Old Kingdom. In about 2630 BC, King Djoser of the third dynasty commissioned an Imhotep, who was an architect, healer, and priest, to build an obsequies memorial for him. The outcome was the Step Pyramid, the world's first significant stone building near Memphis at Saqqara. Pyramid building in Egypt culminated with the Great Pyramid construction of Giza, just outside of Cairo. These pyramids were constructed for Khufu, the ruler from 2589 to 2566 BC. Classical historians ultimately named this pyramid one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The classical historian Herodotus thought that it engaged 100,000 men and took 20 years to make the pyramid. At Giza, Khafra, and Menkaura, who were Khufu's successors, later built 2 additional pyramids. Egypt relished the golden age of tranquility and richness during the 3rd and 4th dynasties. Pharaohs held absolute power, and hence a secure central government was provided. The kingdom did not face any serious threat from outside. Also, successful campaigns in some foreign countries, such as Libya and Nubia, brought significant economic prosperity. During the 5th and 6th dynasties, the king's wealth steadily dried up, partly because of the enormous costs of building the pyramids. His unquestionable power was dominated by the virtue and clergy who matured around him. After the death of King Pepi II of the 6th dynasty, the Old Kingdom ended in turmoil. The king ruled for about 94 years. Many historians don't consider the end of this era as the turmoil or collapse. They find it the beginning of a new era, the First Intermediate Period. The first signs of decline. The 7th and 8th dynasties followed the fall of the Old Kingdom. This era is also known as the Dark Age in Egyptian history. They consisted of a rapid succession of Memphis-based monarchs until around 2160 BC, when the central administration completely disintegrated, triggering a civil war among provincial authorities. Bedouin invasions exacerbated this disrupted situation, which was also accompanied by disease and famine. Chaos occurred, but people who could not afford that royal funeral for them in the past could do it now, and they were happy about it as they considered these to be the guiding texts of the afterlife. While the inscription of the tomb was only done for the king previously, it now became a common practice for other people now too. Unfortunately, there is little to no record of the 7th and the 8th dynasty. The lack of history, monumental pieces, and poor artwork quality led historians to assume that it was the Dark Era of Egypt, but some scholars don't agree. They say that the First Intermediate Period was the era of progress for the lower classes of Egypt. Maybe the era was considered a collapse from the point of view of an upper-class citizen. The cultural image suggests that it was not a dark era or chaotic period for the whole of Egypt. Rather, it was just a period of happening differently from what had happened in the past. 2 distinct kingdoms emerged from this conflict period. Between Memphis and Thebes, Middle Egypt was ruled by a family of 17 rulers, dynasties 9 and 10, who were based in Heracleopolis. In contrast, other rulers' families emerged in Thebes and challenged the Heracleopolis authority. Theban prince named Mentuhotep succeeded in overthrowing Heracleopolis in the year 2055 BC, reuniting Egypt, concluding the earliest intermediate period and beginning the 11th dynasty. The Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep IV, the final ruler of the 11th dynasty, was murdered, and his commander or chief minister became King Amenemhet I, the initiator of the 12th dynasty. While Thebes continued to be a significant religious center, in the south of Memphis, a new capital was set up at Itoi. The kings of the 12th dynasty ensured each king's smooth flow of power, making his successor a joint ruler. Egypt once again enjoyed prosperity in the course of the Middle Kingdom, just as it had at the time of the Old Kingdom. Egypt followed a vigorous foreign policy in the Middle Kingdom. It colonized Nubia and repelled the Bedouins. They had invaded Egypt in the First Intermediate Period. Additionally, the kingdom established diplomatic and commercial ties with Palestine, Syria, and other nations. undertook construction projects that included mining quarries and military fortresses, and resumed the Old Kingdom's practice of building pyramids. Amenemhet III, reigned from 1842 to 1797 BC, was the Middle Kingdom's most powerful ruler. Its decline began under the rule of Amenemhat IV, 1798 to 1790 BC, and continued under the rule of his sister and co-regent, Queen Sobekneferu, 1789 to 1786 BC, who was the concluding ruler of the 12th dynasty and Egypt's first confirmed female crowned head. This era was Egypt's development and progress in the field of art. The popular sculpture of this era was called the block statue, and it became a persistent element in Egyptian architecture for a good 2,000 years. The block statue is a statue made out of a single rock. This era was the time period of major progress in the writing and literature field too. The only unfortunate thing about the Middle Kingdom is that only a few monuments from this era are preserved, because the succeeding kings replaced many of the temples dedicated to several gods or goddesses. But still, this period is considered one of the most beautiful eras of splendid artworks. The Second Intermediate Period. The Second Intermediate Period includes many dynasties from the 13th dynasty to the 17th dynasty. Dynasty 13 was the unfolding of another period of instability in Egyptian history. Meanwhile, the rapid progression of kings failed in amalgamating power. In the 13th dynasty, the rulers neglected the south of Egypt just like the north of Egypt, so the Nubians made their grip strong around the country and then developed a centralized government. The origin of these people is still not clearly known, but people used to refer to them as Kushites, and they were called Nubians by the people of Egypt. The name Nubian came from the word Nub, which means gold in Egypt. As a result, Egypt got divided into various domains of influence during the Second Intermediate Period. Although the government seat and the official royal palace were moved to Thebes, an opponent dynasty centered in the Shwa city of the Nile Delta appears to have continued to exist concurrently with the 13th. Around 1650 BC, a foreign ruling dynasty called the Hyksos took benefit of Egypt's instability to rule. The Hyksos rulers in the 15th dynasty continued and adopted many already present Egyptian traditions in culture and government. They ruled at the same time as the 17th dynasty of local Theban rulers who continued to rule southern Egypt in spite of paying taxes to the Hyksos. Eventually, conflicts between the two groups escalated, and almost in 1570 BC, a war was initiated by the Thebans against the Hyksos to drive the Hyksos out of Egypt. The Hyksos' identity is still not known. Many historians believe these people were the refugees who ran from the Aryan invasion of Asia. Hyksos considered themselves as the true owners of Egypt and regarded themselves as the owner and rulers of the destiny of the Egyptian population. Several 19th and 20th century historians suggested that this period was an era of chaos for the Egyptians. Still, this statement is mostly negated by scholars, saying that trade and travel continued in this period, flourishing the economy of the country. The New Kingdom. The New Kingdom was a thoroughly documented era of the Egyptian Empire. The literacy rate of Egypt increased during the Middle Kingdom and the Second Intermediate Kingdom. Most people were sending letters and written orders. Moreover, the country's foreign ties increased during this period, indicating written contracts and signed treaties. Hence, it became a common practice for people to record and document the whole scenario. Egypt was once again reunited under the rule of the first monarch of the Dynasty 18, Ahmose I. Egypt re-established its control over Nubia while driving several military crusades in Palestine. It also grappled with other powers of the region as well, like the Mitannians and the Hittites. The New Kingdom was the era of expansion of the powers of Egypt. Egypt reached new heights of riches in this period. The pharaohs of this era expanded the region. The expansion of the territories of Egypt was to recover the empire from the weakened condition that it went through in the past. The Egyptian rulers of this era were called pharaohs, meaning great house. Before this, as mentioned earlier, the emperors were called kings or your majesty. The word pharaoh is commonly used when the history of Egypt is discussed, which clearly shows the importance and impact of this era on Egyptian history. The pharaohs of this era used their wealth to build massive temples to God, and Thebes was the cultural center of Egypt. The emperors built the greatest temples for God and for them regarding themselves as gods. Egypt continued to work on establishing the first great empire of the world that expanded from Nubia to the Euphrates River of Asia. Besides the powerful emperors like Amenhotep I, Thutmose I, and Amenhotep III, the new empire was momentous for royal women's role in the state, like Queen Hatshepsut, who took up ruling as a regent for her stepson, who was later the glorious military hero of Egypt. Amenhotep IV was the most controversial emperor during the late 18th dynasty. He commenced a religious revolution and dissolved the priesthoods that were dedicated to the Amun-Ra. He forced people to worship another sun god exclusively and renamed himself Akhenaten, meaning servant of the Aton. Also, Akhenaten constructed a new capital and called it Akhetaten. The capital was built in the middle of Egypt and was later called Amun-Ra. The Egyptians resumed worshipping many gods again, and the capital returned to Thebes. The 19th and 20th dynasties are also called the Ramesside period, meaning the ruling period of the line of kings named Ramesses. This period witnessed the renovation of debilitated Egypt and the construction of splendid buildings, including magnificent cities and temples. According to the records of the Bible, the Israelites and Moses migrated from Egypt during the regime of Ramses II. All the rulers of the New Kingdom were entombed in rock-cut, deep tombs in the Valley of Kings. The Valley of Kings was a cemetery for royal people on the west coast of the River Nile. Almost all of the tombs were raided and demolished, except the treasure and tomb of Tutankhamun. This one was found mostly unharmed during 1922 AD. The magnificent funeral home of the final great king of Dynasty 12, Ramses III, was also found to be comparably well conserved. It clearly showed the riches that Egypt benefited from during his rule. After the death of Ramses III, the successive kings were not very successful in governing the empire, and that's why Egypt lost several states in Palestine and Syria permanently, and suffered from foreign attacks, especially from Libya. Meanwhile, the empire was gradually losing all its wealth. And then the third intermediate period of the Egyptian empire started. The third intermediate period. After the death of Ramses XI, the power of pharaohs continued to diminish during the 20th dynasty, and the priests of Amun continued getting higher status and power. By the end of that period, pharaohs were not playing an essential role in the lives of Egyptian people, and they were not considered as significant as they used to be. This era sounds a bit strange to modern people, as, during this era, the high priests of Amun got more wealthy and powerful than the rulers. Instead of regarding the pharaohs as gods, the religious cults would talk and consult with Amun, and Amun answered them. The third intermediate period is the era of political instability in the Egyptian empire. Significant changes in Egyptian society, politics, and culture were witnessed in the next 400 years. The unified government of the 21st dynasty allowed the revival of the local officials, and the foreigners of Nubia and Libya snatched the power and left a deep-rooted mark on the people of Egypt. In about 945 BC, the 22nd dynasty started with King Shoshenq. King Shoshenq was among the descendants of the Libyans who conquered Egypt and then settled there permanently. The control of the 22nd dynasty began to weaken in the third last of the 9th century. The 23rd and 24th dynasties are not well documented. Most local rulers were sovereign in this era. Shebako, the monarch of the Nubian kingdom of Kush, was the first Nubian pharaoh in Egypt. At the beginning of the 8th century, the Nubian pharaohs established their own dynasty at Thebes. Egypt grappled with the stretching Assyrian Empire in the Nubian pharaoh's regime. The Assyrian emperor, Esarhaddon, forced the Kushite king named Taharqa out of Memphis and then demolished the whole city. After that, he replaced the rulers with officials and local governors who were loyal to Assyria. Among them, the first ruler of the 26th dynasty, Necho, was killed by the Kushite Tanuatamun in an unsuccessful attempt to take hold of power. Alexander's conquest of Egypt. The son of former king Necho, Psammetichus ruled over recombined Egypt for less than 2 centuries in the 26th dynasty. The Persian ruler Cambyses conquered Egypt by defeating Psammetichus III at the Battle of Pelusium to make Egypt a part of the Persian Empire. Persian emperors also ruled the country under the same rules as Egyptian kings did. Darius accepted the religious popularity and began building and renovating the temples. The dictatorial rule of King Xerxes provoked many revolts against him and his successors during the 28th and 30th dynasties. In the middle of the 4th century BC, Persians invaded Egypt again and revived their empire in 343 BC under the leadership of Artaxerxes III, but they couldn't retain their rule for more than a few years. In 332 BC, the armies of the Persian Empire were defeated, and Egypt was conquered by the ancient ruler of Macedonia, Alexander the Great. After his death, the Macedonian kings continued to rule the Egyptian Empire. The first emperor of Egypt following Alexander's death was Claudius Ptolemy, and further reigns were continued with his successors. Cleopatra VII was the last monarch of the Ptolemaic dynasty, sometimes called the Laggid dynasty. She surrendered Egypt to the armies of the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus around 31 BC. For the next 6 centuries, Egypt was under the rule of the Roman Empire. During the reign of the Romans, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire, including Egypt. Later, in the 7th century, Egypt was conquered by the Arabs and Islam was introduced as the major religion. After the Arab conquest. The Arabs conquered Egypt in 641 AD. From the time period of 61 AD to 1517 AD, the Arab caliphates ruled Egypt. Various caliphs, including the Fatimid and Umayyad dynasties, had a stronghold of the Egyptian Empire for 900 years, in spite of the foreign attacks and the battles fought against them. Throughout this era, the city of Cairo was built and regarded as Egypt's capital. In 1517 AD, the Ottoman Turks conquered the Mamluk Sultanate. They reduced it to a province and forced the citizens and officials to pay huge amounts of taxes to the Ottomans. The Mamluks were still a part of the governing body. However, the economy of the empire was weakened, accompanied by famines and plagues, which made the empire vulnerable. The Napoleonic forces then conquered the Egyptian Empire in 1798 AD. After the British defeated the French in 1801 AD, a power gap was left among the Ottoman Turks, the Mamluks, and the armies serving the Ottomans. All these factors set the scene for the independence of Egypt in 1805. The inevitable fall of Egypt. The eras of Ramses II and Ramses III, Egypt's 2 most recent great pharaohs, were distinguished by Egypt's capacity to repel foreign invaders and its military might. However, in order to withstand these persistent assaults, a substantial number of troops and resources were required, and as a direct result, the economy of the empire suffered. In 1177 BC, Ramses III and the Egyptian fleet stopped the Great Sea People's invasion, and the pharaoh wrote about the victory on the walls of his temple and tomb complex at Medinet Habu. While this was a success for Egypt, the celebrations did not last long. Ramses III was able to fight off the Sea People, but he couldn't stop an assassination that was planned against him. CT scans of his mummies showed that he was stabbed in the neck and killed in 1155 BC. Many claim that Ramses III was the last great pharaoh of Egypt, and Egypt started to crumble after his demise. Egypt went through a civil war, and the country was still divided into 2 distinct areas as a result. Following this, there was a domino effect of the collapse of Egypt. The Assyrians conquered and dominated the region in the year 671 BCE. The Persians did the same in the year 525 BCE, and the Greeks did the same in the year 332 BCE. All these events contributed to the fall of Egypt. After Ramses III died, a series of unsuccessful kings, also named Ramses, became the rulers of Egypt. The last pharaoh of the new kingdom was Ramses XI, and he died about 1070 BC. Some archaeological record that are found of that era suggest the reason for the rapid decline of Egypt. For instance, the mummy of Ramses V seems to have smallpox scars on his face, but historians are not sure if the king died of smallpox. It was found that Ramses V and his family were buried in newly dug burials, and there was a prohibition of anyone going to that place before 6 months after the burying of the king. It is possible that Egypt might be afflicted with smallpox at that time. Historians also suggest that this might be the first isolation orders ever because of any disease. Moreover, during the rule of Ramses V and Ramses VI, Egypt had lost control over the crucial turquoise and copper mines of the Sinai Head because their names were found to be the last names that are inscribed on the site. Scholars say that Egypt had most likely evacuated Canaan and Sinai by 1140 BC. In the reign of Ramses IX, the ruler of Egypt at the end of the 12th century BC, a series of tomb robberies swayed Egypt. By that time, the authority of pharaohs had become so low that thieves would fearlessly rob the tombs of pharaohs to hunt treasure and gold. It was devastating for Egypt, but these kinds of robberies stayed persistent for a long period of time. Records suggest that the authority had to move some tombs in order to ensure safety for the mummies. The further evidence of Egypt's power decline as an independent state was a sequence of foreign rule on Egypt. Libyans were the first to overpower Egypt. Libyans were nomadic people that came from the west border of Egypt, and they gradually overcame power. The first pharaoh of the 22nd dynasty, Sheshonq I, tried and struggled to bring back the days of Egyptian glory and power like Ramses III. Under his rule, Israel and Judah were invaded by Egypt in the 10th century BC. After that, the Nubians asked for the throne peacefully during a period of political crisis in Egypt. A string of the Kushite rulers then ruled Egypt for almost a century, till the 25th dynasty. After that, the Assyrian invaders pushed out the Kushites. Historians say that the rise of Kushite rulers in Egypt was the beginning of decline of Egypt and its independence. After the Kushites were kicked out, Egypt was ruled by the Assyrians, then Persians. After that, it was under the rule of Greeks, then Romans, and then it was conquered by Muslims. Egypt had the last taste of greatness under the Greek rulers, who ruled Egypt after the demise of Alexander the Great. The greatest ruler of this dynasty is Cleopatra VII. She was indeed wisest of them all. She was the one to construct a spectacular Hellenistic capital in Alexandria. As the Roman monarch Augustus defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra in 30 BC, the ancient Egyptian dynasties came to an end and Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. The fall of the Egyptian Empire was marked by a period of time in which the weather was stormy and unpredictable. The Egyptians had long departed on the floods of the Nile to foster the growth of their crops, but for the better part of a century, the climate in Egypt dried up, and there was a severe lack of water. In addition to this, there were extended periods of abnormally cold weather, which added to the strain that was already being placed on the crops, and led to a significant drop in agricultural production. The unpredictable and widespread flooding of the Nile was responsible for the loss of crops. When there is either a shortage of food or an abundance of food for a lengthy period of time, hunger spread. In addition, the decline of the ancient Egyptian monarchy was brought on by political and economic instability. When it came to the distribution of wealth, there were enormous disparities between those at the top of society and the rest of the people. Many individuals have acquired a lack of faith in the leaders of their governments and religious institutions as a result. The persistent conflicts were exceedingly costly, which diminished the pharaoh's ability to exert his economic authority. As a result of the spread of Christianity across Egypt, the hieroglyphic writing system was eventually supplanted by the alphabet, and significant cultural shifts occurred. Numerous practices that were used in the past, such as mummification, are no longer used either. The history of Egypt is kind of like a roller coaster ride, having ups and downs, with in the end, the speed of rise diminishing and the eventual downfall. An empire that lasted for 3,000 years came to an end.